Absolutely. Fuad, thank you very much for inviting me to appear together with you in this video brief in order to contextualize a very difficult subject, which is the history and the current state of affairs of what is known as anti-normalization, which is a concept that began many, many decades ago in the modern period in the Middle East, among the Arab states, even before Israel was reestablished in 1948. In the mid-1940s, the Arab League officially established anti-normalization as a policy of the League, which was an attempt to completely boycott, isolate, and corner Jewish commerce and the Jewish community in the pre-state, what was called pre-state British Mandate Palestine, in the mid-1940s. That Arab League policy continued with great energy, regretfully, until the Oslo Accords were enshrined beginning in 1993 and then institutionalized in September of 1995. And that's when the Arab League stopped their official policy of anti-normalization, even though there have been continued efforts by individual countries in the Arab League at anti-normalization by not even recognizing Israel. But when we talk about the term anti-normalization, we need to understand that that was really an attempt to completely subvert, corner, isolate, and even Nazify Israel, if you will, by making it a what they call a leper state. That was the attempt of the Arab League. I would say, very fortunately, the problem today of anti-normalization is much more acute in the West than it is even in the Arab world, because you see the Arab world having many states in the Arab world having better relations with Israel and normalized relations with Israel, as opposed to countries in the West who have official boycott policies and anti-normalization policies. The concept of anti-normalization, though, as a government policy, was much more developed under the apartheid South Africa regime in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, until 1994, when South Africa became a real democratic republic, and the policy of apartheid of the government of South Africa ended with the election of Nelson Mandela. This is an important point because the international community has embraced the principles of anti-normalization as it was manifested against the South African regime. So that's why you see these very misguided statements comparing, the one and only democratic and free nation state of the Jewish people, with a Jewish majority character, but having minorities from different areas, including 20% Arab Muslim minority in Israel, that have exactly the same rights in Israel as Israeli Jews. But nonetheless, there is sort of a propaganda indoctrination popularity using the term apartheid Israel, which can be broken down, dismantled, uprooted in about 30 seconds for anyone that had an 8th grade education in what apartheid really was. But nonetheless, what we are witnessing is the institutionalization of terms like Israel apartheid, Israel anti-normalized relations with Israel, because it becomes part of a much deeper indoctrination, not only not really in reaction to any particular policy, but in reaction and in rejection of the entire idea of a nation state of the Jewish people, which as we know historically has existed for 3,600 years. So we have moved along the path of anti-normalization as an Arab League policy which was really a political idea. And now it's become a much deeper idea of existence, of the rejection of existence of any, even in the West. I mean, by Western actors and Western governments and Western institutions, Western organizations, international institutions, against the concept of the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think that anybody on the international scene who's an honest person would have to admit that that's what they are rejecting. They're rejecting the very idea that the Jewish people, after 3,600 years, are no longer deserving of their own nation state. That's what anti-normalization means. Anti-normalization from the Soviet period, in the 19, particularly I would say in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was used as a weapon against the United States-led Western alliance. I want to repeat this point. Anti-normalization against Israel picked up fuel in the Cold War period as a tool of war between the Soviet Union and the United States, because the Soviet Union led the third world countries, the non-aligned countries, in a, I would say, in a global assault using anti-normalization against Israel in order to leverage the Soviet Union's war against the United States. They accused the United States actually of being Zionists, and in fact, they were, in a very paradoxical way, I must say they were right. This, in a negative sense, is what the Soviet Union was trying to pin on America, not because there are 60 million non-Jewish and mostly evangelical Christian Zionists, but in order to isolate the Jewish and democratic state by attacking America economically, commercially, in media, in popular culture, as being, the serious and most loyal ally of Israel in the West.
So I want to ask you specifically, I ran into the anti-normalization guideline on the BDS website. If anti-normalization is a policy of the Arab League, what is it doing on the BDS website? What's the connection there? Could you connect those dots for me?
Is your question, what is the anti-normalization doing on BDS if in fact the Arab League has reversed its policy?
Yeah.
Well, I think we can look at that problem as two discrete problems and not one collective problem, because what has happened beginning with the Soviet period is the Soviets used the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, an internationally designated terror organization that was responsible for the deaths of Europeans, the deaths of Americans, the deaths of so many Israelis and others, in the 1970s through airplane skyjackings and other, the Munich massacre was a PLO, Black September, a terror assault. And what underlied all of that was anti-normalization. In other words, anti-normalization became a Palestine Liberation Organization terror policy that went hand in hand with their kinetic physical terror attacks. They were at the same time isolating Israel in all these other ways, in the media, diplomacy, international commerce and trade, the public square, et cetera, et cetera. So the Palestinian, let's say, national and Islamic movement made anti-normalization beginning in the 1970s as a centerpiece of their global assault against Israel and the Jews and most of the Jewish people who are friendly to, amenable to, supportive of Israel. So that's what it's doing on the site right now, because the BDS, the BDS movement, I would call it the BDS crusade, that was officially launched in 2005 following the very famous Durban conference against xenophobia and racism. If you remember, in Durban, South Africa, in 2001, that conference, that international conference that was sponsored by the United Nations itself, became it was supposed to be a conference to reject and counter racism. It became a festival of hatred against one country in the UN system of the 193 countries, and that was the state of Israel. And we saw that normalization became sanctified and sanctioned. That led to development. Oh, am I broken again? It's important. It's important for us and our viewers and our friends watching to note that anti-normalization became turbocharged, highly fueled, beginning at the Durban Conference against racism and xenophobia and other forms of racial intolerance. It was a very famous conference that took place in in August 31st to September 8th, 2001. And we both remember what happened 72 hours after that conference, were the Al-Qaeda 9/11 attacks. And it wasn't by chance that the attacks by 19 terrorists, that actually most of them emerged out of Saudi Arabia, in the Al-Qaeda jihadi movement, that came on the heels of what was really a non-military global assault called anti-normalization, because they go together. There is the psychological, diplomatic, economic, media, social network terror. That's called the Eighth Front, together with kinetic terrorism that we saw on 9/11. And what happened, Ifad, at that conference in 2001 is that the United Nations, and it was Mary Robinson, the official UN senior representative, who essentially sanctified anti-normalization against Israel, because in the summary NGO conference, or the NGO session at the end of the Durban conference in 2001, they actually condemned Israel as an apartheid, genocidal, war criminal, you name it, they accused Israel of it. And therefore, this terribly misguided, even ridiculous summary conference of the NGOs at Durban adopted all of this anti-normalization policy, and that spread in an official way to their home countries, to their foreign ministries, to their professional classes, the trade unions, and the like. And then and from there, and this is how to answer your question, this is how the BDS national movement has this on their website today. In 2004 was the establishment of the Palestinian, what's called PACB, the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, which was the precursor to the official launching of the BDS movement. In 2005 was the BDS call. 2007 was the Boycott National Committee in Ramallah, in the former West Bank of Jordan, to get back to the roots of the anti-normalization, which is in the Arab world. The Palestinian National and Islamic movement made this a big weapon in their arsenal against Israel. And from 2001 until today, which is 24 years later, they have made it, kind of like a combination of an F-35 fighter jet, tanks, and propelled these heavy weaponry. It's a heavy weapon in their satchel, and unfortunately, countries in Western Europe have adopted it uncritically and without any kind of simple analysis that would completely disprove, dismantle, and uproot the charge of either apartheid or genocide, and then that would really undo the very foundations of the anti-normalization crusade against Israel if they ever cared to do the most basic level of homework, which unfortunately these very highly educated, highly developed countries have failed to do.
Yeah, and we see that so strongly now with the Eurovision, because if you go to the BDS website, You Google Eurovision, you find over 50 articles of all the fights that their BDS has been holding against Israel in the Eurovision, which is a perfect example of what anti-normalization is. So you can't do commerce with Israel, but Israelis should not be participating in anything that anyone does, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, we wrote a book, if you can find it online, called PACBI, PACBI. It's a booklet exactly on this. And what do we talk about there? The Palestinian move back in, I think it was back in 2000. It was back in 2011, I think, in the Eurovision. There was a Eurovision contest there that the Palestinian Authority was driving the anti-normalization at the Eurovision. So this year's Eurovision crusade against the Jews was rooted very much in the Palestinian Authority strategy of using international platforms like Eurovision, and like the UN and other internet, and like the UN agencies, the International Criminal Court, and other international cultural and sporting, scientific and academic fora in order to advance this absurd notion of anti-normalization. And let's remember, this is only directed at one country. One of the smallest states in the international scene is being accused of a crime that only, the Nazi Germany, with the largest, in the largest states in the Western world, was accused of. So they're accusing us of, genocide, apartheid, colonialism, as a state that constitutes a minute dimension of the very region that it claims that it's colonializing, which on its face makes the thing look so stupid, and people who advance this to be completely ignorant of what they're talking about. So in the end, I think that that stupidity will reveal itself. In the meantime, it's a very important case of indoctrination, and one that the Palestinians are using with the greatest of energy and intention in order to try to cause Israel's implosion through the isolation anti-normalization strategy.
So just to wrap it up, thank you so much. It's been so insightful, and I love hearing from you. This is really, really great. You're connecting so many dots for me, and I'm sure for everyone that listens. Is it correct to say then, in light of everything that you just said, that the BDS is basically importing anti-normalization rules from the Arab world to the West?
Yes, I mean, the West is importing anti-normalization from the Middle East to the West, beginning with the Arab League, metastasizing and focusing in the Palestinian National and Islamic movement strategy. Also, a large part of the Soviet strategy against the U.S. and the Western Alliance in the 70s and 80s. And today it's being adopted, most ironically, after the worst one-day massacre against any Western country in modern political history. 1,200 people, women, children, raped, tortured, and murdered in fewer than 24 hours. And it is exactly the victims of genocide and apartheid policies by Hamas and by the PLO that are now being projected onto the victims. So anybody that has a psychology degree or is even interested in the psychology of terror understands that the way that the Soviet active measures, disinformation campaigns used to work is to blame the victim for the crimes that it itself is committing. And that is exactly what's happening today with anti-normalization. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Authority, the Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all prosecute anti-normalization policies that they're now, that they're blaming the Jews for being the criminals that they are, and that Hamas publicly accepted responsibility for, by the way, on October 7th, in the name of the Quran, in the name, what they called Tufal al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa flood, which was using religious imagery from Islam in order to justify the mass murder of children and women and men, and then to anti-normalize we'll end on this point where people should think about how this Islamic attack has actually triggered anti-normalization among the highly secular West. That is an extraordinarily bloody and painful irony to consider, and that people of goodwill and intellectual integrity should think about that, because the Islamists, I don't have to tell our friends in France and in Western Europe the challenges that they are facing from second and third generation Islamists with citizenship across the European Union. That is what is happening in the anti-normalization movement against Israel. And in the end, it is an anti-normalization movement against the West, and they use Israel as an excuse to prosecute anti-normalization policies against the West. So our friends in Europe and across the European Union and the West should think about that, I think, that point rather carefully.
So just one more question, if that's okay with you. We see a lot of BDS activity pursuing anti-normalization rules in city halls across the world, right? So they go to city hall and they say, even the tiniest city out there, big, small, doesn't matter, the US, Europe, everywhere, they just go and they try to pass all kind of different anti-normalization resolutions in city hall. So is that just a direct attack on Israel, or is that a way to gain power within the city hall system? Is that a Trojan horse?
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is well taken, and the point actually marries two sub-points, which is to say that today city hall anti-normalization resolutions are used to divide and conquer the relationship between Jews and the Jewish and democratic state. And they do it under the guise of what they call legitimate criticism of Israel, which is a complete mendacious and completely ill-advised bifurcation. There is the 95% of Jews are Zionists. Zionism is the historic national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And if you can't have Israel without the Jewish people, and you can't have the Jewish people without Israel. It's like having a body with no heart or a heart with no body. They have to go together. So this very false and dangerous attempt to destroy the connection between Jews and the Jewish state under the guise of political criticism of the Jewish state is a malicious move by many in City Hall to say, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Israel. That is a false bifurcation. There is no such thing. If you are destructive of the idea that the Jews don't have their own nation state, then you must, by definition, say the Irish, French or Irish Americans have no right to Ireland, and Italian Americans or Italians living in Europe have no right to Italy. It's a complete malicious and uninformed bifurcation, a division. So and yes, that's how today, because anti-normalization has become a laundered word for Jew hatred, they just call it anti-normalization because it sounds so virtuous. Why does it sound virtuous? Because it's exactly the same policy that the international community mobilized against apartheid South Africa. So if that became the moral standard, well, then it's completely clean and understandable and acceptable to mobilize it against Israel. But it's a terribly misguided policy, and one that is, yes, used in order to gain greater power, because Jew hatred today is an engine to getting publicly and politically acceptable power. That is the danger of anti-Semitism. That's what it was in Europe. That's what it was from the Crusades. That's what it was in the Arab world, and it continues until today. And people of goodwill in the West have got to wake up, particularly in the Jewish community, and understand that this is a gun pointing not only at the head of Israel and the Jews, but it's pointing inside the mouth of Western civilization itself, because that is ultimately what this Islamic policy is. That, by the way, Morocco has separated itself. Other Arab countries have separated itself from this anti-normalization actively. The UAE, Bahrain, and even Sudan. Even Sudan, which was, the grandmother of the three no's in 1967. No to Israel, no to normalization, no to peace, no negotiations. And Sudan today is the four yeses. So those countries have moved away from anti-normalization. The West, unfortunately, has embraced anti-normalization. So we see this inversion between the Middle East and the West, which is a very sorry state of affairs for many countries in the West. So it's time for all of us to wake up.
Thank you so much, Dan Diker. That was amazing. Looking forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I'd be happy for you to send me a copy when you edit.
Of course, of course. I'm actually stopped recording now.